Hey there, it's BoardGameDave, and welcome to part 2 of my Farshore review. Now, obviously last week we talked about Farshore in a vacuum on its own merits, and we talked about the pros and cons of this game and my overall review. Today we're going to talk about Farshore versus Everdell, because I feel like it's very difficult to talk about this without talking about that. Now, for a bit of background, in case you don't know, Everdell came out in 2018 as a worker placement tableau game with these cute critters and wonderful art and components, and it was instantly a blockbuster success, selling, tons of copies, and immediately there were tons of expansions and different editions and this collector's edition, which is what I have. 5 years later, they released Farshore, which is a very similar game in the same universe with very similar art by a different artist. And yeah, very similar gameplay mechanisms, but this time with a nautical seafaring theme. But beyond that, these two games were very similar, so much so in fact that I think the general consensus when Farshore was released was kind of a sense of disappointment among gamers that these two games were so similar. In fact, I feel like they share about 94% of their DNA if you look at the gameplay mechanisms. So today we're going to start by talking about those differences as well as the similarities. We're going to go through my criteria for reviewing games and talk about which one does better in each category. And then at the end of the video, we'll talk about whether or not you need both games in your collection, as well as which one you should get if you could only choose one. So lots to get through, but first of all, let's go ahead and dive into the differences between Farshore and Everdell, which is assisted greatly because on the back of the Farshore rulebook here, they have this quick rules comparing Farshore to Everdell page. And with 10 bullet points, they tell you everything basically that's different between Everdell and Farshore, which is already indicative of how similar these two games are, that you need just a one-page reference explaining some of the new things in Farshore. So let's dive into this very quickly. First of all, for setup, okay? In the one season in autumn, you only have one extra worker to add. So in Farshore, you play with 5 workers total. In Everdell, it's 6. So it's a slightly shorter game there. Duplicate cards that are out in the bay get stacked. So you always have 8 different options, although that's very easy to house rule into original Everdell, which many people have suggested. The card deck has been rebuilt with many new abilities and changes. That's true. Overall, they're familiar abilities, but there's some new ones in there. Of course, there's the ship that advances in Farshore, and you're going to collect treasures as you go and score lots of points. That is, to be fair, completely new and unique in Farshore. The treasure tokens can be used as a wild resource, and they're 2 points each at the end of the game. The events are gone, special events and basic events in Everdell, and they're replaced with these map tiles, which sort of work like the basic events in Everdell, but you're racing to get them. And there's a multiplicative factor where you're scoring the number of map tiles with the points on the tiles, I believe. Next, occupied tokens. So of course in Everdell, if you had a construction and then you were trying to play a corresponding critter, you could play a little occupied token to get that critter for free. In Farshore, you can only do that 3 times, and you have anchor tokens to help you remember that you did that. However, each type of construction allows for anchoring or chaining for free any type of critter of that same type. So it doesn't have to be exactly the court and the judge or whatever it was in Everdell. So there's a little bit more flexibility and freedom there. There are no open red locations, so you don't need to see what other people are playing in their tableau. You can just focus on your own, which is helpful. In general, and this is a big one, resources are slightly harder to get, and cards are easier to get and more frequently used for purposes other than playing them into your city. Cards are easily acquired and they come and go fast and loose, but again, resources are harder to get. And finally, the last player to reset for the next season has to do a little bit of setup, upkeep for the game. And that's it. So with those 10 bullet points, they cover pretty much all those differences. And as far as similarities go, virtually everything else is the same. So yeah, when it comes to that differences versus similarities, there's your differences. Everything else, if you've played both games, you know they're very, very similar. Next, let's go over my 7-point criteria for reviewing games and see which game fares better in each category, starting with art and components. Now, this is a little bit tricky for me because as an amateur artist, both of these games have stunning, beautiful, gorgeous, immersive art, and I don't really have a clear preference between the two. Now, if you didn't know, Andrew Bosley did the art for Everdell, and Jackie Davis did the art for Farshore. So two different artists with very similar styles and similar quality as far as I can tell. So beyond maybe just preferring Everdell a tiny bit over Farshore, they're basically equal in art and components, and they both equally have a redundant and sometimes infuriating big component, the tree in Everdell and the lighthouse in Farshore. So I would say they're equal there. As far as complexity versus audience, I'd say they're fairly evenly matched. I did mention last week that Farshore is a little bit simpler and a little bit more streamlined. This game says ages 10 and up, and this game says 14 and up. So if you're looking for a lighter, approachable, family weight game almost, Farshore would be your better bet, whereas the more strategic, hobby, strategy gamers might lean toward Everdell. But as far as complexity versus audience, I think they both nailed it. So again, no clear winner here. Thematic integration, same thing. They're both very thematic. You're sending out workers to collect resources, to build constructions, to entice critters to move into your town. The player with the best town wins, and they both do that fairly well. Next is intuitive mechanics, and this is where, again, because Farshore streamlined some of those fiddly elements, I think that actually Farshore is a little bit more intuitive. There's less to keep track of, less of those open locations that like I mentioned earlier, those special events that you have to squint to read and try to go for, collecting the exact right cards. I think that Farshore is a little bit more intuitive, so it gets the upper hand there. Next is replayability, and this time I'm going to go toward Everdell. Again, with those special events, you can really change the feel of a game because everyone's rushing to get those special events. So that is an advantage Everdell has, although they're about equally replayable. I wouldn't say there's one clear winner over the other. It's just that Everdell has those special events and Farshore doesn't. Next is length and fun factor, and I'd say that this time I think Farshore wins out by a little bit because it's just a little bit shorter. With that one fewer worker, this game goes a little bit quicker, averaging about maybe an hour 10, hour 15, whereas, in a two-player game, I've had Everdell go to maybe like an hour and 40 minutes. And with more players, Everdell can stretch a little bit too long for my taste. So in that sense, I think maybe Farshore being a little bit quicker is the winner there for length and fun factor. And then finally, cost versus value. Now, I've been looking around online, and it seems like pretty much anywhere you look for these two games, Everdell is going to be a little bit cheaper, maybe $10 to $15 cheaper than Farshore. So in that case, all other things being equal, I think that Everdell is better bang for your buck. It's better cost versus value because, again, for $10, $15 less, you're getting a very extremely similar game for less money. So I would say Everdell wins out there. But again, overall, across those 7 criteria, they're pretty much even, so that doesn't really help us differentiate these two games either. So which of these two games is the better game? Now, I hope you're able to see through this video that these two games are very similar, so it's hard to come up with a concise, clear, and objective winner as far as which game is better. But I will say that if you're looking to buy one of these games, there's something really important we need to talk about, which is expansions. So Farshore does not have any expansions currently for the game, and I don't think that they're planning on any expansions for this game. This is just a standalone base game, no expansion sort of game. And if you like that, this is all you're gonna get and there's nothing you gotta have FOMO about, this might be the one for you. On the other hand, if you, like me, end up falling in love with Everdell, you might get to a point where you kind of want to add some new gameplay elements and mess around with new expansions, and Everdell has tons of expansions for you to explore. So that would be my preference, is having the base Everdell, and then down the road, if you feel like it, adding some new expansions. Not to mention that, again, Everdell's a little bit cheaper than Farshore, so you can use that money you save to buy some of those expansions, do your research, and pick one that fits well with your gameplay, style. So in that sense, I think Everdell has the advantage. That being said, the big question as well might be, do you need both of these games in your collection? Now, the designer of Everdell compared Farshore to the Azul games, which had many sequels, as well as to the Ticket to Ride sequels with the different maps. And I'll say that Farshore does not reimagine the game of Everdell the way that the Azul sequels did, right? Summer Pavilion, Queen's Garden, those are big differences from base Azul. I would compare this more to those Ticket to Ride maps, where it's a very familiar game with just a few tiny gameplay tweaks. Or another analogy might be Great Western Trail, which has, Argentina and New Zealand. Again, familiar games with a bit of a twist. That might be a closer analogy for Farshore. That being said, I don't feel like I need both games in my collection because these two do such similar things gameplay-wise. In the same way, Great Western Trail, it was one of my absolute favorite games, in my top 3 games of all time, and I don't feel like I need the Great Western Trail sequels, at all. I'd like to play them, but I don't need them. So, if you're sitting at home with Everdell and you're thinking, do I need Farshore in my collection? I personally don't think that you do. You've got a great game here. Farshore is very similar. If you've got Farshore, do you need Everdell? Probably not, unless, again, you're going for those expansions. So that's my 2 cents, but I'm more of a smaller collection kind of guy. I'm not a completionist, as you might know. So Everdell plus expansions is a great way to go. And speaking of expansions, I do have 2 expansions that I'm planning to review next week. So I've got Mistwood right here. I've got New Leaf right here. 2 very interesting, intriguing, and fun expansions. So make sure that you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss my coverage of these 2 expansions next week. If you're interested in watching that solo playthrough of Farshore and you haven't yet, you can check that out right there. If you somehow missed part 1 of this review when I talk about Farshore on its own, you can check that video out right here. Of course, leave a question, leave a comment down in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And in the meantime, have a wonderful week. Take care and happy gaming. Bye.